Why? Uh, Often, I've spent a great deal of time in public positions over the last 40 years at all levels of government, from the White House down to City Hall, and a lot of time on dealing at the edge of policy and science, the edge of science and engineering, the edge of engineering and law. And one of the problems we have is communicating between us. And Cynthia is a national treasure because she's one of these brilliant scientists that really can communicate and dumb down things for the rest of us so that we understand what's going on. For me, Sandy was the tipping point. My wife, Kristen, who helped put on the symposium and who has been responsible for everything from the graphics here to the logistics to discussing the substance of it. And I own a antique floating lighthouse. And I've been through 4 hurricane-level events in that ship. We were in New York City when Sandy hit. We went up the Hudson away from the dock, and we were the second ship to come back into the port of New York. I had been talking about the concept of Nichi for a while, but it wasn't until we docked in New York City the day after Sandy that I realized we had hit the tipping point. To see the devastation, despite all the planning that had gone on, despite the foresight of having focus on climate change, a report in 2008, and then adapting it every year, it was clear to me that this triple threat of rising sea levels, extreme storms, and aging infrastructure is a true threat to our national security as well as our national economy. I wish every one of you could have come in on the lightship that day into New York City, seeing it dark in all of lower Manhattan, black, seeing all the traffic lights out, seeing water everywhere, parking garages filled with water, subway entrances filled with water. Cars had been floating around, and not seeing first responders because they were in emergency situations, literally putting out fires and saving lives and trying to get people out of hospitals into other hospitals. And then to go down the New Jersey Turnpike and seeing cars backed up for 3 miles trying to get a gallon or 2 of gas. And then coming home and having no electricity for 2 weeks down there. This it was, in fact, the tipping point. And that was my call to action. So, Cynthia, thank you so much for communicating with the rest of us. I look forward to a long, continuing conversation with you on this subject matter. The next speaker, Julie Wormser from Boston Harbor Associates. Let me just tell you a little bit about Boston Harbor Associates. When we brought the lawsuit to clean up Boston Harbor, it became very clear that government can only do so much. That it really is a citizenry that is passionate about a cause and continues year after the infrastructure and organizational aspects of a new organization such as the MWRA are put into place to carry that momentum forward, to keep the agency fresh and keep its feet to the fires, and to, again, coordinate between government and business and science and policy. Boston Harbor Association, is the organization that did the very first comprehensive study on rising sea levels in Boston. It wasn't the state that did it. It wasn't the feds that did it. It wasn't local government, the city that did it. It was an organization of private citizens under the leadership of Julie Wormser and Vivian Lee, who have been in the trenches for a long time as true believers, trying to figure out how you marshal the strength of the private sector beyond these goals. And no one has done it better than the executive director of Boston Harbor Associates and the president, Vivian Lee, and the Boston Harbor Association that has brought to us a really solid, good look at what's going to happen in Boston and what we have to do about it. So with those words, I'd like to introduce to you Julie Wormser.
Thank you very much. So I was theoretically putting the finishing touches on this report on October 29th last year as my house was shaking, and we realized we needed to throw this out and start over because we'd have a much wider audience after Hurricane Sandy. This report, as folks have mentioned before, this was not the wake-up call. Really, Sandy was the wake-up call for coastal flooding. This was really a primer on what to do next. So we looked at, we did maps of Boston's vulnerability to coastal flooding. It's a bathtub model, not wind and waves. Looked at what private and public property owners could and needed to do to decrease risks. And then also identified case studies, including UMass Boston and our historical downtown wharves, to say how does one look at one's property and identify what to do over time. So Superstorm Sandy, 1,000 miles long. It devastated our transportation systems, cultural icons, electrical grid, residential areas. But this is what it looked like in Boston that day. This is what we get when we have a wicked high tide, is what we call it here. The astronomical high tide when the sun and the moon align and pull the ocean in the same direction. Why was it so different between Boston and Sandy? It wasn't just because, Boston and New York. New York City was really hit where Sandy landed, but it was more than that. Coastal flooding is from the wicked high tide. You know, what time of month does it occur? So in Boston, we get another foot or so of water, up to 2.5 feet of water, storm surges, and then underlying sea level rise. And I have a daughter who just finished tantruming in the bathtub, and I learned to lower that water in the bathtub to keep her from sloshing over onto the floor. But a very high level of water in a very tantrumy child versus a calm child and a low level of water makes a significant difference to the bathroom floor, as the equivalent does to one's streets and subways. So here's New York and here's Boston, about 400 miles apart. But more than that, Boston is protected by Cape Cod, Cape Ann, and offshore the Stellwagen Bank. As well, we have a very large, wide harbor with 34 islands before you hit downtown Boston. Unlike New York, which had water coming on both sides of New York, of Long Island, so the water piled up right near Manhattan and has a very narrow, almost islandless harbor, so there was nowhere for the water to go but up. What this means that in terms of storm surges, Boston's 1,000-year storm surge, which of course doesn't mean that once you get one, you get another millennium to get another one, means it's a 1 in 1,000 chance of hitting in a given year. Our 1,000-year storm surge is significantly lower than New York City's 100-year storm surge. So we located our state's capital in a very, very good harbor. Doesn't mean that the rest of Massachusetts doesn't get hammered. So during Sandy, while Boston was getting 2-foot waves, Scituate and Gloucester were getting 25-foot waves. But here's the tide gauge at the Battery. This is what it looked like during Hurricane Sandy. So the blue line is the predicted tide. The green line is the storm surge. The purple flat line is essentially wicked high tide. And then what happened is the high tide and the storm surge are additive. So what the Battery saw, Lower Manhattan saw, was an almost 14-foot storm surge, as Cynthia mentioned. In Boston, this is the Coast Guard station in Boston where we have our tide gauge in the Inner Harbor. Our wicked high tide happened 5.5 hours earlier. Our storm surge was lower, and it happened at low tide, which is why Boston was predominantly spared. The third piece, and I'll go back to that in a moment, the third piece is obviously underlying sea level rise. This is from the recent IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. The difference in the ranges are business as usual carbon emissions versus doing something about it. But this relatively conservative report says we can expect a global average of 1 meter or over 3 feet of sea level rise by the year 2100, about a foot by mid-century, more in the Northeast. So when we did our report, we used the range of likely to possible sea level rise for planning purposes. Because even though an average rainstorm in Boston might be a couple inches, we've had 13-inch rainstorms. You don't want to just plan for the likely. You also want to plan for the probable or possible. So we looked at a 1 to 2 foot increase by 2050 as likely to possible, and a 3 to 6 foot increase by the turn of the century as likely to possible. So Boston, and as the data get better, each of these estimates keep going up, not down. So Boston, being very well situated, we have not had a whole lot of coastal flooding. We are very, very close to the water. That's our problem, really, is underlying sea level rise. So this is what happened in Hurricane Sandy. Again, we get a few of these a year. We got almost none of these until 1975. We've gotten up to 7 wicked high tides since, in a combination of a foot more of sea level and these astronomical high tides. So Sandy was one such. The yellow, just around our historical wharves, a little bit in South Boston, that's 0 to 2 feet of flooding. That's the picture you saw before. Had Sandy hit at high tide, all else equal, had Sandy hit Boston 5 hours earlier, this is the flooding we would have had. So this was a near miss. We got a second near miss in Nemo in February, 4 months later. So we had what we call we had near misses of 100-year floods 4 months apart. And again, as that underlying sea level increases, just like the level in a bathtub, you need smaller and smaller storms to overtop our seawalls. So this is 7% of Boston. It's our current 100-year flood. But with sea level rises of up to 2 feet by mid-century, sometime around mid-century, this could be an annual flood. What's really striking is this is our daily high tide by the turn of the century. This is a very different city without change. So what kinds of things flood at that level? I've been trying to call this the innovation district, not the inundation district, but this is the hottest new area in Boston, which is all landfill. 30% of the city is really reclaimed land from the sea, and this is no different. Bayside Expo, which UMass Boston just purchased probably for dorms, just down Columbia Point from us. Fort Point Channel, this is Gillette World Shaving Headquarters, where all Gillette razors are made. The USS Constitution, Charlestown Navy Yard, and even City Hall. So a 5-foot storm surge would actually go all the way through Faneuil Hall to the City Hall. This is what Boston would look like with 7.5 feet of water above our today's average high tide. This would be this is not today. This is Hurricane Sandy in 2050 at high tide, right? So more of those unlucky stars need to align to see this kind of flooding. But this is future flood levels in Boston. And you can see the original shape of the city start to emerge as the sea reclaims its own. This is more like 30% of the city, in part because it also overtops the Charles River Dam. This would be our 100-year flood event around the mid-century, and we could see this every year or multiple times a decade around the end of the century. Again, this is a very, very different city if we do nothing. This kind of flooding starts to really affect our commerce. This is Logan Airport, 6 feet above high tide. Connolly Terminal, where our cargo comes in. Downtown Wharves, there's the aquarium. East Boston and South Boston. So what do we do with this knowledge? And again, I want to thank New York City for taking one for the team, because although we really missed the worst of it, it sure did accelerate our planning. the city of Boston, again, that leadership was terrific, and we hope that the new mayor is equally as motivated. They just released a report called Climate Ready Boston with what they've done in the last year. So they have finished a vulnerability assessment of the municipal infrastructure, not private property, but city property. They're preparing guidelines based on best practices for new developments for climate change adaptation. Again, not just flooding, but also heat waves. They're developing a wetlands ordinance. We've never had one before. They distributed homeowner flood protection information. And finally, next year's third climate action plan will focus on climate change preparedness, and that's being developed right now. But this is too big of a problem for just the government, just any level of government. We also need to have considerable private sector actions. Every building in that flood zone needs to develop vulnerability assessments and time-phased preparedness plans and incorporate these plans into regular maintenance schedules. We are lucky in the city of Boston that predominantly our issue is sea level rise because we have such a protective harbor. The towns around, outside the harbor are really focused on emergency preparedness short term. But we have the opportunity to really enhance our infrastructure and private property over time in a bit more predictable way. And then if you have a bill, as many people learned in New York and New Jersey, even if your building is fine but you have no power, you cannot use it. So we need to work between private property and the utilities and public agencies to make sure that the public realm is also prepared. So I'm going to pick on the T for a moment. This is the Marriott Hotel on Long Wharf, right there. That to the MBTA. That arrow is the Aquarium T Station. This is what a very dense time-phased preparedness plan looks like. I'm going to walk through it. You don't need to absorb this. All of this is available for free on our website, Boston Harbor Association. So the thing that is very counterintuitive is as you go down, flooding goes up. So 4 feet is about or 0 is about mid-tide. So down here is 16 feet above mid-tide. This is how high tide changes over time from today to the turn of the century. This is how our annual flood increases over time from today to end of the century. This is our 100-year flood. So here's the poor T station sitting at 7.5 feet above mid-tide. So, and over here you basically say, am I worried? The green is you're good to go for now. Orange is you can do something at a building level. Yellow is you need to do something at a neighborhood level. Red is you can no longer protect your building from flooding. You need to either move up a floor or inland. So what can you learn from a dense preparedness plan like this? First is you can say, what do I have to worry about today? So for the Aquarium T stop, today, high tide does not affect the T. Today's annual flood does hit the T. And if you noticed in the photo before, they did have some sandbags getting ready for Nemo. But the T is already vulnerable to our 100-year flood. So that's to notice. A 100-year flood doesn't come very often. You could put sandbags around the station. But if that station floods, that's the blue line that cuts off the whole North Shore from the rest of the subway station. The other question you have that you can answer with a time-phased preparedness plan is, when do I have to worry? So here's our annual flood. Again, today, not such a big deal. By mid-century, every year, the T's going to have to deal with 1.5 feet of seawater. By the end of the century, it's dealing more with 5 feet of seawater. There's an elevator right there. You go into the T, there's a very small foyer, a very long escalator, and then you're right in the T. Very difficult to manage 5 feet of water. So the general manager of the T says, aha, in my next capital improvements budget, I need to move that station. There's no use in elevating it because at some point it's going to actually be inundated. So one thing the Boston Harbor Association has been really thinking about is this idea of living with water. People have mentioned doing giant sea dams across our Boston Harbor islands. Don't know what that would do for all the money we spent on the cleanup, for one. But it also would sap all of our money to do anything else. So we're saying, if you can't dam the water, what do you do with that water? You can't keep back the tide. How do you live with the tide? So some of the ideas are favoring resilience, meaning how quickly can you come back from flooding as opposed to keeping that water out. Part of that is elevating vulnerable resources, whether it's our electrical grid or the Museum of Fine Arts basement, or rugs versus tile. How do you elevate resources that would be damaged by salt water and pairing that with areas that can flood without damage? And finally, how do we incorporate flood control into the livability and vibrancy of our city? Some of the examples are right here in Boston. Spalding Rehab has become a poster child of excellent adaptive design. So they are right out, they call it World's End, at the end of the Charlestown Navy Yard, which is a very floodable area. They got caught in the credit crunch in the Great Recession, and they could not build this building until they could get credit. So they decided to learn from Katrina about flood control. So one of the things they did was they kept critical patient programs off the first floor. That's all conference rooms and a cafe. Their windows open if their generators fail. That was one concern where the New Orleans hospitals got to be over 100 degrees in the summer. Their electrical equipment and other services are on the roof. And none of their critical floors are below the high estimate for the 100-year flood almost 100 years from now. So they're good to go for a while. Plus their landscaping is also very floodable. Other ideas that I think will be really relevant for Boston when we're looking at this much flooding. So Seoul, South Korea, they had a big dig project like this, like we did. This is their big dig. They had an elevated highway over a capped canal. It smelled, it was dark, it was noisy, similar to our Southeast Expressway. It really depressed the neighborhood. Instead of building an at-grade greenway as we have, they went below grade. This water actually has to be piped in. It would normally be dry, but they've created this beautiful, beautiful social space. This is during their dry season. They have torrential summer rains that had been a real flooding problem. But the Chungachung Channel is like our Newbury Street, or the Seine. It's beautiful. It's full of lights at night. It's become a social center of the city. This is what it looks like during the rainy season. You can see the cars are still on the ground. It's protecting the infrastructure and the buildings around it. Similarly, their Han River, like our Charles River, on both sides they've created green space. On one side, playing fields, on another side, a natural area. That's the dry season. That's the wet season. If you look closely, the equivalent of their Storer Drive and Memorial Drive, they're still going. This is this idea of living with water, not wading through water, but channeling it where you want to go so that you can allow it into your cities without damage. So we've been talking about this idea of a sapphire necklace of canals to go with our emerald necklace of parks. Some other ideas from around the world. This is a floating recreation center, I think in Rotterdam. It's 8 acres, obviously a temporary building, but fantastic. Not going to flood if it's floating. This is in English called a sand motor. They dredged and dumped a tremendous amount of sand, which really dampens the storm force. Currents and storms redistribute the sand along the coastline and protect more vulnerable areas behind it. This is a beautiful harbor walk in Spain. Look how it really mimics coastal area. There's a jogging path below that brown is wood, and it's both a tremendous public asset, but you can also imagine how it could channel water into canals or storm drains behind it, protecting the infrastructure behind. So you create a tremendous social space as well as coastal flood management. And finally, this is the GCANS project in Tokyo. It is an underground area that drains the city. They make movies in here. It's a tourist attraction. So this is what it looks like when it's dry. It's fantastic. This is called the Underground Cathedral, and yet it is great flood control. So if you remember only 3 things from this presentation for Boston, today's 100-year flood could well be mid-century's annual flood and 2100's high tide. Property owners must develop time-phased preparedness plans to meet the increased coastal flooding over time. And policymakers need to work with property owners to help overcome the technical or financial barriers they need to protect their own buildings, and then help when private action is insufficient, such as in the public realm. Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here and honored to speak